John Kennedy. We are at the law offices of Irwin, Venick in Nashville, and this is June 26, 2018.
Okay. When I hold this up, you'll have 2 minutes of recording left. You can record in 20-minute bursts.
Okay.
So this is a mark for clip 1.
This is the interview of John Lee Kennedy, Vanderbilt Law School graduate and practicing attorney, on June 26, 2018 at the law offices of Irwin, Venick. The interview is sponsored by the Southern Historical Collection of the University of North Carolina, who is working in conjunction with Vanderbilt University and the Student Health Coalition. So good morning, John.
Morning.
I'd like to ask you to tell us about your first involvement with the Student Health Coalition, how you learned about it, what you were doing at the time.
Well, this happened in late winter, early spring of 1971. I was finishing my second year at Vandy Law School, and there was a meeting at the law school put on by the Student Health Coalition, mainly Carolyn Kleiss. Carolyn was the student director. I think she was between her third and fourth year at Vanderbilt, undergrad, and she was the student director of the Health Coalition for that summer. There had been 2 or 3 law students that had worked with them the year before. Dave Dawson, Ernie Rosenberg, and a name that escapes me right now. She was Congressman Evans' daughter, but her first name just is gone. But so I presumably Carolyn spoke with one of those 3 about putting on a recruiting meeting at the law school. That interested me. I'd had some exposure to coal miners down around Tracy City at Mont Eagle and Swanee in southern Middle Tennessee in my young days. Of course, those still were my young days, but my younger days. And so out of that meeting, Jim Bryan, who was a contemporary of mine finishing his first year in law school, we both evidenced an interest in doing this for the summer, and started, attending meetings and learning about what was going on with an orientation of that June, and so up we went in June of 1971.
And what was your understanding of what the Student Health Coalition wanted you to do as a young law student?
Well, the first thing that was pitched to me or discussed with me through Bill Dow, and I think just Bill, was a study of the East Tennessee Development Districts. It was a fairly new organization at the time. There were a series of development districts across the state, and it was actually national legislation that created them with kind of a companion state legislation. I think the genesis was there was some conflict in getting Appalachian Regional Commission money or something like that. But I always felt a little guilty to Bill about that. But by the time I got up there for the first few weeks, was following the health fairs around, and White Oak, and then Briceville. And it didn't take long to be just inundated. When I heard there was a law student there or a law guy or whatever, that we just got inundated. Jim was with us too, but he wound up getting lodging. Maurice really helped him find a place with a family, so he stayed up in Claresville that summer. I went on.
John, before we go on to what the citizens wanted at the health fairs, which we want to learn a lot about, do you know why Bill Dow wanted this investigative look at the economic development districts, and do you know what was behind that, or what was the importance from Bill's perspective?
I think from Bill's perspective, and was that these development districts had a role to play in approving federal funds going to health organizations and other community development organizations. They may have had some role to play in state funds. I simply don't recall. But I think Bill's concern was that they worked up through, at the time they were called county judges, county executives, city mayors, and such, and that they tended to reinforce the existing power system in some of these counties to the detriment of some of the old coal camps and outlying areas who were extraordinarily underrepresented. And I think that was his motivation.
All right. So when you say you were inundated by the citizens who were attending the health fairs, what were their needs? What were they expressing to you they needed from law students or lawyers?
Primarily black lung and other Social Security claims. There were some VA benefit issues as well. But I just had no idea of the scope of the problem when we got there. And the same thing happened to Jim. There were folks who, with minimal education, were trying to put together fairly extensive claims for black lung benefits. A law had been passed in, I think, 1970, establishing the black lung benefit program as a branch of Social Security. And you had to have, just as you would for a Social Security disability claim, good evidence that you were disabled. And there had been, I think the regulations were, one set of regulations were enforced by then, and you had to meet certain levels of disability measurements by pulmonary function studies or X-ray evidence that your lungs were indeed highly impaired from coal mining. And that these guys, because at the time they were all men, would be typically in their mid-40s up. And they would have all worked in deep mines. Strip mining did not come in to large-scale use until somewhere in the 60s, I think. And that's outdoor. These guys were shut up inside the hole in the ground. A deep, dark hole, as Gretchen's song says. And with dust control, which is non-existent for these guys. First guys, the earliest ones would have used picks and shovels. By the 40s, continuous mining machines would come in with long augers that bore into the face of the coal seam down inside and creating an enormous amount of black coal dust. If you walked into a working mine, you'd be coughing within minutes. And I later saw, we'll get to later with United Mine Workers, cross sections of a miner's lung with black lung. And it's basically a section of black rock. You could tap your finger against it. It'd be like that. And what that does, there's the dust itself, there's the microscopic dust that gets into the areola of the lung, clogs them up, but it also causes scarring called fibrosis, which can, once it gets started, can continue. Long after they're out of the mines, their lungs are steadily getting worse.
And how does that impact their ability to function on a day-to-day level? I mean, beyond the internal changes to their body, what are the external effects on their lives?
It really depends largely on the person. There are some who, for whatever physiological reason, can work in the mines for 30 or 40 years and be quite active, even under those conditions, which is just remarkable today. There are others that with less than 10 are just functionally disabled. They can't get their breath. it's the effect is like somebody with emphysema or lung cancer. You just can't get your breath, and you functioning on a desk job. If that was available, these guys might have been a possibility, but it wasn't. These were all people that worked with their hands.
And what was the circumstances relative to their access to either doctors who knew about this disease or to lawyers who could help them with their claims when you arrived in that summer of 1971?
Well, Dave Dawson in particular kind of forewarned me about the lack of really of both.
And who was Dave Dawson?
Dave Dawson was a law student who was there in 1970, went up with the coalition. As far on the medical side, this was kind of a new disease. As I understood it, there were a couple of doctors out of West Virginia who in the mid to late 60s started really bringing it to the attention.
What were their names?
Well, there was Dr. Rasmussen, I can't remember their first names, and a Dr. Dohm. They were both, I know Rasmussen was a pulmonologist. I'm not sure if Dohm was or not, but he certainly had a lot of black lung cases. And they were, raising consciousness of that among the medical profession. But there really wasn't widespread knowledge. That's probably, some would call it miner's lung. They just knew the coal miners would have breathing problems. But as labeling it as pneumoconiosis, progressive disease, not really. As far as I knew, I'm sure there were exceptions. I just don't know. When I was working on cases, I wound up sending people to a couple of doctors down in Knoxville who had some knowledge of it. Unfortunately, those names are gone.
I assume some of these men had been members of the United Mine Workers Union. What was the union stance with regard to black lung, their history, and what, in the summer of 1971, what, if anything, were they providing to their constituency?
For whatever reason, and I never understood it, there may be some sort of power play, but the leadership of the UMW at the time had opposed the original black lung bill. And they were of minimal assistance. I assume the pension program helped some medical care. While I later worked for the Office of Occupational Health and Safety in the union, and was told at the time that Tony Boyle just forbade them. They helped some by going around their boss.
And who was Tony Boyle?
Tony Boyle was the president of the United Mine Workers. He had been personally handpicked by John L. Lewis, the legendary founder. And it was told to me later by people who knew Lewis that he considered Tony Boyle his worst mistake. But he was from Montana, had some coal mining background, but not really in sync with the whole Appalachian scene. And his whole modus operandi, as I stood it, was just to maintain power. And maybe he viewed black lung legislation as a threat in some regard. I really don't know. But in 71, he was still president. Reform efforts had started. I assume we'll get into that shortly. But that was still the union stance. Individuals would help individuals. But as far as the union stance, overall, no great push.
But there had been a recent election in which Tony Boyle had been challenged in 1969. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the follow-on events?
That didn't turn out well for the challenger. It was Jock Oblonsky from Pennsylvania. He challenged Boyle, ran against him for president of the UMW in 69, and Boyle won. but they still viewed Yablonsky as a great threat. He was on the governing board of the union, one of the reps. And even though he lost the election for president, he still maintained a board position. Through a kind of complicated chain of events, Tony Boyle was assassinated. Jock Yablonsky, his wife, and daughter were all assassinated on New Year's Eve, 1969. Is this time to go into some of those connections?
Tell us about the investigation of the crime and
Right.
what connections were made to East Tennessee.
Well, there was, and now I've gone blank on his name, a special investigator out of the U.S. Attorney's Office, actually of Pennsylvania, investigating the crime. And they had a real good lead from Yablonsky himself, who one of the killer's wives had cased the house a few weeks earlier, and he had alertly written down the license plate number. And they used that to get to the lady who was Mrs. Gilly in Cleveland. Her husband, was the daughter of the president of UMW District 19, headquartered in Middlesboro, Kentucky, which covered East Tennessee. Miss Gilly recruited her husband to do the killing. I'm sorry, I had that wrong. Let me think can we go off for just a second?
Mark for clip 2.
Right. Yeah, and Albert Pass, excuse my mistake there, was president of the local office in District 19 out of Middlesboro. He had a field organizer named Bill Prater. And Bill, I'm not sure if Pass had ever worked in the mines or not, but Prater sure had. And he was a foe of strip mining because strip mining required a lot less workers than underground mining.
And where did Mr. Prater live at the time? In what city or town?
I think he lived in Middlesboro, Kentucky.
Okay.
I'm not certain of that, but I could be corrected. But he, through Pass, was a devotee of Tony Boyle, also on the union board as a district president. And they hatched a plan that I want of skimming some money and to pay off killers. They, in turn, or Pass in turn, pulled Bill Prater in, who went to a man named Silas Huddleston, who lived in La Follette, who was a union rep, working under Prater. Huddleston got his daughter, who was Mrs. Gilly, in Cleveland. And they got hold of the daughter. They pulled in her husband and 2 other individuals who actually did the killing. And since the feds had a good lead with the license number, they found the killings pretty quickly.
Well, we'll come back to them later, but I want to return now to the black lung activities in your summer of '71. In addition to the individuals who were asking you and Jim Bryan for assistance, tell us about any community level activities that might have been going on to address black lung.
All right, well, almost by happenstance, either Jim or I saw a little flyer for a meeting about black lung in La Follette. And we attended, and it was put on by Bruce Goins, who had either graduated from law school or was going to law school. I can't remember which at the time. Bruce was, I think he was possibly from Minnesota, not of a coal mining family, but he married into a coal mining family in Charleston. Phyllis Workman was his wife, and she was later to play Loretta Lynn's mother in the movie Coal Miner's Daughter. And she and her dad were singers. They went all around West Virginia, East Kentucky, Tennessee, doing music shows. Her dad's name was Nimrod. And so Bruce gave a little account of what the, on the surface, what the Black Lung Association was, and coming out of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, of being an organization that was first helped get legislation passed to put the Black Lung benefit structure into place, and then to help individual miners with their claims. And that may have even said that they were looking at a set of amendments to the law as well. But that interested us. That interested several local guys, notably Columbus McGee, who lived in Jacksboro, spent many years in the coal mines, and was able to tell hair-raising stories about Union wars in around Harlan, Kentucky. And another fellow named A.B. Marlowe, who was kind of an interesting case. He actually owned some land up in the Clairfield, Davis Creek area, and several others. So there was then, well, before we get to that, Bruce told Jim and I that the underlying purpose for the Black Lung Associations was to reform the union and support a man named Arnold Miller, a retired coal miner out of West Virginia near Charleston, in his effort to run against oil and start making the union a relevant force.
And the more public explanation that was given that evening for the reason to support a Black Lung Association was what?
Was to assist coal miners in getting benefits and making beneficial changes to the law. And these guys understood organizing. They did it when their lives were on the line, really. So they didn't have to have that explained to them too well, much the benefits of organizing around Black Lung benefits.
And what was the level of support or opposition that night? What was the nature of the discussion at that initial meeting?
Very general, very general. Jim and I didn't have a good read on what might come out of it. When we didn't know beans. I mean, we didn't have a good read at all. It's like Neil said yesterday, this is all an invention. So we convinced or talked to Columbus, he didn't need much convincing, to have a follow-up meeting and decide whether to form an association. Let folks think about it, sleep on it. And Bruce was not at this follow-up meeting. But they had a meeting, and
was that later in the summer of 1974?
Just a few weeks later.
Okay.
A week or two later. In La Follette. And I don't have any doubt that, although we were careful not to say anything about union reform, Arnold Miller and the like, that these guys, or a goodly number of them, could guess what was going on or figure it out. They're not stupid people. And everybody knew about the Jablonski killings. Everybody knew about the Silas Huddleston and local connections to it. There was no secret. They probably knew before the feds did. So there was some implicit danger there in organizing, and some were reluctant. And then Jim, who was from Nashville, and whose father probably never saw the inside of a coal mine, but gave up and gave a little speech saying that his daddy had been a coal miner, that he'd never been in the mines, but if his daddy were still alive, he'd want him to do this. And it worked.
And Jim's last name again?
Jim Bryant.
Jim Bryant.
So they formed and started having a few meetings. We were raw. We were getting a copy of the proposed rules and regs. I rang down to the UT Law Library in Knoxville because there really wasn't anything in the area. And there were probably a few lawyers who had done a few cases, but there wasn't really much education. Excuse me. And that's kind of where things stayed. Ended on that. The note they ended on that summer. Now, in the meantime, there was one lawyer from Knoxville named Greg O'Connor, who I think Jim knew him before I did, because I believe he was brought in by Maurice Cirillo.
At the Model Valley?
At the Model Valley, right. He started meeting with these black wild when we were back in school, meeting with the Black Lung Association members and talking about their claims. I don't know that Greg really knew of or had any inclination to get involved in the union reform effort. He was in private practice in Knoxville, coming up and doing a good thing. And it was a good thing. Later on, we may get to it, but later on he was accused by some of the local bar in Campbell County of shopping for clients by coming to these meetings, and I wound up doing them all for him in his place.
And what sort of legal offerings did Maurice Cirillo have at the Model Valley location?
At that time, I'm not really sure. I don't think there was much, because Jim was up there just helping as he could. That developed a little later on, after the summer of '71, to my knowledge.
So you went back to law school
Mm-hmm.
over the academic year.
Right, still carried on a few cases of representing folks during that senior year, went up for several hearings and such.
So you graduated from law school at Vanderbilt in the spring of 1972.
Right.
And what did you do next?
Well, Jim and I decided we were going to try to get some more people, some more lawyers. We saw a need. And Jim had finished his second year. So we recruited Irwin. I'm not sure he needed much recruiting.
Irwin.
Right here, Irwin Venick, the guy sitting behind you. John Williams. And John was eager for something. He had worked for Ralph. I'm sure he told you he had worked for Ralph Nader the summer before. And he was looking for a public interest thing before he had to spend some time in the service. So this was perfect for him. And it turned out to be perfect in lots of ways. But Cliff Love and Russell Overby, they were both, I'm trying to remember what year of the school they were, and I can't remember. I think Cliff had finished his second year, and I'm not sure about Russ. He may have just been his first year.
Yeah, Russ started with me.
Okay, good, thanks. And my hope had been that Jim would kind of work with the people around, because John and I had to study for the bar exam. And I continued to meet some with Black Lung Association and work on, some items. But honestly, from John and I started going down to Crossley to the first bar review sessions that Mr. Crossley, Howard Baker's partner, put on. I think they started that year. And so we were down at UT Law School several nights a week. And again, as anybody who's been through that knows, you cram like crazy for a few weeks beforehand. But Jim had gotten an offer from a local lawyer involved in Democratic politics, Larry Woods, to go to the 1972 Democratic Convention with him. And I can't really blame Jim. He did. It'd be hard to turn that down.
So the other young law...
Our oversight suffered quite a bit as a result.
So eventually you passed the bar and
Mm-hmm.
you were back in the coal fields.
Right.
Can you pick up the story immediately after the summer of '72?
Well,
how your role evolved?
Well, I'd already decided to go up there after law school, so we got that worked out. Paid the principal sum of $400 a month from the Health Coalition to go up there. Duties were pretty much undefined. It was probably to help some of the organizers that had come in from SOCM, and do other work as well with Black Lung. It wound up being mostly Black Lung. Because the association, once John, and I roomed with John Davis, who's also a Health Coalition alum from the summers of like '71, 70, 71, and 70. I don't think John worked with him in the summer of 72. He wound up having a job down at the welfare office in Clinton, Tennessee. So we got ourselves somewhat settled in that fall and wound up working with a batch of black loan claims. And we would go into folks' houses who really were. One lady which insisted on feeding me. All she had was eggs. She was a sweet little lady, old lady who lived in Bryson. She was pursuing a widow's claim because her husband had died. Just like Social Security, you can get widow's benefits from black loan too. The house it did have a wood floor, but you could have been forgiven for overlooking it. She just didn't have the wherewithal to keep it clean. But eggs were cooked, so that was okay.
That was your legal fee.
Yeah. I mean, the Social Security had set up a system where lawyers representing black individuals on black loan claims could claim a fee out of the back pay. You would get, if you won a case, you would get a monthly amount, and you would also be entitled to as much back pay as you could show, typically from the time you filed your claim, or maybe if you could go back a little earlier. And sometimes those could amount up to $15,000, $16,000, $17,000, good money at that time. For example, Bird Duncan used his back pay to put siding on his log house.
And how was the Black Lung Association progressing at this point, and what were they up to?
At the time in 72 and early 73, they were still, well, the first impulse, electing Arnold Miller, the sub objective, that was successful. Miller was elected, I believe, in late, maybe December 72, somewhere about that line. So that part was done.
And what did that mean?
That meant getting, well, it meant getting a murderer, and as Bird Duncan called him, a thug, out of the top office of the union, and a lot of his fellow travelers with him, although a lot of them still stayed on the board. The indictments had started to flow by then from the murder case, including Albert Pass with District 19, and unfortunately Bill Prater, who got pulled into it. And Bill, last time I remember seeing him was at the Bradley's house. He was a big supporter of soccer, and he was also protecting Helen Cook and Jane Sampson, who were two organizers. Helen came first, then Jane, who for soccer.
What do you mean by, how did he offer protection?
Well, just like being for reform in the union, and probably more so, being against strip mining could be dangerous, physically dangerous. I recall a meeting in Jellicoe, in Middlesboro in early 1972 that Senator Fred Harris came to. He was an Oklahoma senator, and kind of running for president, and he was making opposition to strip mining, one of his things, one of his platform arguments. At that meeting, I hung around with a few folks in the back of the room while others testified, and heard two old boys talking to me, you know, somebody tries to take my job, I'll kill him. And I said, well, I'll take this guy seriously. He turned out to be Bird Duncan's nephew, one of the Braden boys. And I actually helped him and another guy incorporate a little deep mine years later. But this was real.
And what did the change in leadership at the UMW mean for support for black lung victims?
Well, that brought it in-house for the union. That became a priority. Instead of having meetings just wherever you could, you would have meetings where union reps showed up and offered support and but paying for people to go to D.C. and testify, supporting in all kinds of ways. That made a lot to that. It didn't mean as much for strip mining, but from the black lung side it did. But Prater put out the word that nobody was to hurt or tamper with Helen and Jane. They had a house in Jellicoe, an big old frame house, well, big for the area. And they and Linda Hart, who was a nurse practitioner at White Oak, lived there. And Mr. Prater got indicted somewhere in the latter part of 1972. Was pretty well removed from the scene. And I think it was on New Year's Eve, or not New Year's Eve, maybe December of '72. Their house got burned to the ground. Happily, none of the three of them were there.
Did they ever find was it believed to be arson?
Yeah, believed to be arson. They believed it to be arson, but I don't know of any investigation or anything that came out of it as far as finding anybody.
And
They moved to La Follette after that.
And just briefly, what? Okay.
Mark for clip 3.
John, what sort of work were Helene and Jane doing?
Okay, Helene Cook, I think had come during 1972, and Jane came, I think Helene was there in the summer. She came in late 1971, excuse me. Jane came along was brought in a few months later. They grew out of the whole John Gaventa work about the American Association and the film that was done that discussed through John and Neil yesterday. Save Our Cumberland Mountains started getting organized that summer of '71. John had as much or more to do with that than anybody else. He was the fellow who learned about J.W. Bradley and went to talk to him.
John Gaventa.
John Gaventa, yes. And out of that work over the winter, and I don't really recall in depth what was done, but Helene and Jane had an apartment in La Follette, and they continued to do organizing work, other work showing the film, going into communities, assisting people who had been, like Lewis Lowe, who John Williams represented, whose property had been ruined by floods, bringing mining gook from the strip mine pits onto their land. Dealing with and doing some work with the Tennessee legislature trying to get a better strip mine bill passed, which eventually happened after John came in. And so they were targets.
Of whom?
Of mine, strip mine operators, owners, the whole structure. And of course, the ones who would have most likely been involved in burning their house were the low guys on the totem pole, the people working in working the heavy equipment or working in strip pits or somebody in their family. Kind of like the Jablonski killings. The lower rungs did their dirty work.
John, let's jump ahead to the next summer, the summer of 1973. Were there any important developments relative to black lung and supporting black lung victims?
Yeah. In that summer, I had word from Bird Duncan that I assume Bird's name has come up. I don't need to say who he was.
Who was he to you?
Bird was, we were kind of, John Davis, he was kind of a father to John Davis and lots of folks, particularly those of us who lived close to Bryson, but see them on a regular basis. And Bird was the chair of the board for the Bryceville Primary Care Clinic. And he held a jamboree for years at his property. It was up on 2,200 foot up on a shelf on Cross Mountain, Pilot Mountain, excuse me, which went up further, right around early July for the Health Coalition kids.
And what did Bird let you know that summer?
There was a guy named Larry Baker who had given them some assistance with the clinic, helping recruit a nurse practitioner. Larry worked for TVA in community development. I didn't know precisely what his job title was, but saw him on a regular basis. He had told Bird that he had heard of some state money for black lung clinics, or something of that nature, and made some efforts with the state health department to learn what it was, and it just didn't really find much. But probably in July of that summer, Columbus McGee called me about going to Charleston for a meeting about this, that he had learned, that he had gotten word of. At the time, I told Columbus I'd have a problem because I was going to work on a charter for the Mountain People's Clinic organization. I'm not sure if it had a name by then. But then Columbus called John Williams. John called me and said, why don't I, John Williams, work on the charter and you go with Columbus? Which made eminent sense to me. So that's went to Charleston with Columbus. And met several folks from the union. A guy named Tom Rodenbaugh, who was a new hire, came in with Arlen Miller, working, and his job was to work with these black lung associations. And he was employed in the Occupational Health and Safety Office of the union, which a doctor and other administrator working under him were finally somewhat freed to do this after Boyle was gone. So we learned that what was happening was that National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety had was wanting to do a pilot program of granting money to several states with coal miners and black lung cases in them. Tennessee and Kentucky were two of them. They were all across the coal fields, eastern and western coal fields. So we started following up on that as best we could, and then learned a few months later that the Tennessee Department of Public Health viewed its mission as, at least as far as lung disease, as combating tuberculosis, and they saw this black lung as a diversion. They were granted around $145,000 for a 2-year pilot project, and apparently just didn't know what to do with it. And then it transpired that they were also in the process of closing down what were the old chest disease hospitals or TB sanitariums. So this just didn't meet what they were looking for. And with some help from Dr. Painter, John Painter was with the UMW Health Fund, Pension Fund, had a meeting or two with the head of that department, a fellow named Dr. Anderson, pretty unproductive. And we learned by then that they were just going to not use the money and give it back to the feds. I had a friend named Frank Sutherland, still do, who was a reporter for the Tennessean at the time, and talked to him about this, and said this was pretty outrageous. He agreed it was pretty outrageous. He talked to John Siegenthaler, who has had a pre-existing history with Marie Cirillo and the whole everything she was working on.
And he was the publisher of the.
And John was the publisher of the editor. I think he was the editor at the time, editor of the Tennessean. He also had a history with the Kennedys, Bobby Kennedy's family, and was aware of the connection between Marie and Ethel Kennedy. So not long after that, there was a front page story about the state. I won't use the term I used in private. Not following up on the grant, and an editorial or two. That got the state more interested, and Tennessee wound up doing the same thing Kentucky had already moved into doing, contracting with the union to start and administer this project for them. And the project was essentially a series of outpatient black lung treatment centers, trying to avoid hospitalizations. Folks were being hospitalized just to get on the breathing machines. And it made much more sense to either have a clinic setting where they could use stationary machines and take little nebulizers, squirt things that people still use home with them.
So the flow of the money would have been from NIOSH to the state health department,
Right.
and then a contract out to the UMW.
Right. Basically, just federal, contracts with all the standard federal terms and conditions.
So you had to win the support of the health department to receive the federal monies in order to make this happen.
Yeah, and of course that wouldn't have happened without a working, functioning union office to do it, and willingness to do it.
And so, how did it play out there in Jacksboro in terms of the clinic and any local support that had to be generated?
Well, the fellows who were the most active guys in the Black Lung Association, which means that although they were sick, they weren't as sick as some of the others. They were able to get out and get around. They talked about that fall of '73, the interest in doing a clinic. I kind of had to be brought along because I really wasn't sure about that. But when we got the chance for Tennessee to get a program going, it made a whole lot more sense.
What were the names of some of those local leaders?
Well, Columbus McGee, A.B. Marlowe, Willie Cooper, and Willie Cooper was also a water witch. He could take the fork stick and find water underground. And John MacArthur actually stayed with Willie Cooper one summer, or summer or fall when he first was up in East Tennessee.
And what was your role by the fall of '73 with the Black Lung Association as the prospect of this clinic was emerging?
Well, with the prospect of a clinic, I've been meeting with them monthly and doing other stuff. And, people, Columbus and others say so and so needs some help, and so we go help so and so.
So it's fair to say you were still shepherding.
Yeah, and it was
group.
a loose, unincorporated group of folks meeting. So we had to kind of reform it, formalize it, charter it, change it, and grow it into an organization that could actually be the governing body for a clinic. So we were working out and got that worked on. And then through early '74, or the first half of '74. Did some of the other work, like getting a grant of land from Campbell County Quarterly Court, it was called back in those days, of an old poorhouse office that was no longer being used, right by the railroad tracks on the road to Columbus's house. And
this was for the location of the
for
clinic.
location of potential clinic, working on the lease with the county, seeing, being kept close touch with UMW through a field worker named Tom Ludman, and just working on the various steps that had to be taken to bring that to a reality.
And do you know about when the Jacksboro Black Lung Clinic opened, and what was the reaction of the local people?
Well, there were several steps before that, but it really didn't open as an operating body until early in 1975. over Labor Day, September of '74, building on what Rick Davidson had told me. Worked up an application to the National Health Service Corps for a couple of docs for Jacksboro.
And what was the name? What were the names of those eventual doctors?
Dr. John Twigg and Bob Firestone. They arrived at the ETRC offices for their first meeting with the board. I'm trying to remember the month in 1975, but it was early spring. I remember my first.
This will be the mark for clip 4.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, one of them was Mr. Dr. Twigg. The other one, Bob Firestone, was even more visually arresting when he came walking up to the ETRC front door. He was about 6'2" or 3", had a big, I think, leather cowboy hat on, a big belt with almost looked like a Navajo made belt, silver belt buckle, boots, cowboy boots. I think he had a Fu Manchu, and a long ponytail. Fit right in with the East Tennessee boys, just perfectly. Nothing unusual about it at all. I confess I had to go off into the copy room at ETRC and just laugh for about 2 minutes, and then came back out once I composed myself. So I brought this.
And these were the doctors funded by the National Health Service Corps.
Yeah. And they turned out to be great guys. And particularly Firestone just was a natural for that era. Just fit right in.
And what was the reaction of the local people once the clinic got open?
Well, once the clinic got open, and by then we had already established the Tennessee plan for the black lung clinic, and they got pretty good patronage. I mean, it started slow, but it got better. Particularly when Dr. Huggin, who was a retired pulmonologist from the state TB hospital, and really a ball of fire for a little old white-headed man. He would come through a few days a week, and I think he also, at times, he rotated up to Norma, Stony Fork, and I'm not sure if he ever went to Petros. Rick Davidson and I were trying to remember about that a few weeks ago. We just couldn't remember. But particularly on those days, there would be more patrons. We had to enlarge the building by 2 trailers. Because when my boss, Bedford Berg, got a good look at it, and he had been involved with the Occupational Health and Safety Office for many years, knew how to start a clinic. Knew with a glance what it needed. He said, "No, this isn't big enough." I thought, "God, we got a bunch of rooms. We got at least 3 rooms."
John,
But
when
we got one function as an office and one function for more examining rooms.
John, we've been talking about the lead up to the opening of the Black Lung Clinic in Jacksboro, Tennessee. But can you give us the NIOSH money was obviously available, in a broader area. Can you just put this in the context of what was happening in nearby areas of Appalachia in terms of?
Well, my other area to cover was Eastern Kentucky. We had another guy in the office from Pennsylvania who covered several, Western Kentucky, Fort Smith, Arkansas, and some of the Utah areas. Eastern Kentucky took more work. It was contentious is one way to put it, but it was an interesting, exciting place to be. But as far as the clinic program goes, we set up outpatient clinics in Prestonsburg, Harlan. There were miners hospitals, UMW run hospitals there, and then 2 other places, one of which was Mud Creek, Kentucky, which the Health Coalition had done, I think, possibly in 1970 and 71, health fairs there to help that clinic, which was already organized with a community board headed by a forces matron named Eula Hall. They were already, going we didn't have to form a board. They were going, we just helped them get on their feet, bring up the interest. But we put one of the clinics there because it was just a natural place. And at the same time, as part of the program, particularly in Kentucky and in Tennessee as well, there was money for paralegals to help people with their claims. And in Tennessee, John MacArthur wound up being hired on that and wound up winning the case of, what's his name, Virgil from Norma. I'm blanking on his last name.
Virgil Burris.
Yeah, Virgil Burris. John wound up, I started his case and John finished it. But in Kentucky, with so much more deep mining than Tennessee ever had, there was actually a separate organization called Kentucky Miners Healthcare, which really didn't do healthcare. It was there to provide paralegal assistance, loosely supervised by Alphared. They had a main office in Wheelwright, Kentucky, site of an old coal camp, and they fanned out, their people fanned out to the different clinics and we gave assistance.
So, John, I want to ask you to give some comparison between that first summer of 1971 when you went up to the coal fields and what you saw about the level of medical and legal services for miners, and then jumping to 1975 after the NIOSH money became available and the leadership of the union had changed. How would you compare those two different time frames?
I haven't really, honestly, it developed organically. We were feeling our way. And I hadn't really thought about comparing the two that much, but it's striking. A total, an enormous difference. People could get help. There were more lawyers familiar with black lung claims. They could get better assistance from knowledgeable individuals. Dr. Huggins, particularly, had been one of the early folks learning about pneumoconiosis. He was an expert, and again, that worked in two different ways. That healthcare by itself was improved, but the ability to put forth a good, convincing case for the federal black lung benefits was also improved because proof was easier to come by.
Now, turning back to your career specifically, you, I think, made a change in terms of employment, and could you tell us when that was and how it came about and how your career developed?
Yeah, I had, by summer of '74, I pretty well decided to come back to Nashville, several reasons. But Eula Hall, this requires a little more background as well. There was a union organizing strike at the Brookside Mine near Harlan, Kentucky in the summer of '74. Columbus McGee and several others from Tennessee learned of a march, supporting the union organizing efforts in Harlan, and we went up to it. And right after that, Eula Hall came, got probably physically grabbed me, but she said she wanted me to think about heading up this Kentucky Miners Healthcare that they were forming as part of the Kentucky Black Lung Treatment Program. And really before I'd had time to get a chance to get back to Eula, and of course the articles already appeared in the Tennessean, and things were moving in Tennessee as well. I don't know if the contract had been signed yet or not. I'm not sure. But Tom Ludwig contacted me. He was the union rep that was working out of the Occupational Health and Safety Office about offering me a job heading up establishment and initial management of the Kentucky and Tennessee programs under the Black Lung Treatment Program.
Of the UMW.
Of the UMW. And that changed my plans a bit. It just too good to resist. I mean, here was a chance to kind of cap off the Jacksboro clinic work and some of the others as well. I mean, it's just too good to resist. And for 27-year-old to go up to DC for a while, that was good.
So mark for clip 5.
Okay.
John, tell us a little bit more about your stint in Washington, managing the program in Eastern Kentucky and Tennessee.
Okay. Well, I moved up. I started in Washington like December of '74, and went for a week or so just seeing what the program was about. I'd seen some of the grant proposals and such, and I'd met Bedford Bird, who was my immediate boss, but I don't know if I'd ever met the head of the division. But Dr. Lauren Kerr, who's I don't know if he was a pulmonologist or not, but he was a medical director. And then in January, really got into it full time. Kentucky was an easy program to imagine because there was a lot more money. You had functioning miners hospitals to work with. Mud Creek Clinic, which was functioning, had been going for a while, and then another clinic in Allen, Kentucky. Right now, I can't remember the name of it. It wasn't too far from Mud Creek, but it was easy. And then the Kentucky Miners Healthcare, the paralegal organization headquartered in Wheelwright. That was a fairly easy, already laid out for you to figure out. It quickly became apparent to me that for $70,000 or $80,000, we weren't going to be able to do the same thing in Tennessee. I'd originally hoped to have a little thing at Weissville, a little thing up at White Oak, a thing at Stinking Creek, at Petros, and wherever else. And huddling the Bedford Bird became quickly apparent to us we were not going to be able to do it that way. It just wasn't the funds. And that was a disappointment. But I think Bedford Bird knew Dr. Huggin pretty well and started pulling him and another doctor in to brainstorm how to do this program in Tennessee. By then, Rick Davidson was already there circulating through the Mountain People's Health Council clinics. We started looking at that as a model. That if Rick could do that, why couldn't Dr. Huggins do the same thing, using Jacksboro as a base and fan out to work in the other clinics? And we weren't going to have a separate paralegal thing. There wasn't a chance for that, but like the Kentucky model. So that's by March or so, I'd say. We had hit upon the plan, discussed it with Black Lung Association and others. We did not have the full support of the Medical Association in Campbell County, which was no surprise.
We'll say a little bit more about that.
Well, it took some doing, and Bill Dow had a big hand in that later on in '75 and '76 of getting Twig and Firestone to get bidding privileges to the Fallen Hospital. And that was not an easy thing. I didn't have a whole lot of involvement in it then.
But what was the core conflict between the Medical Association and the National Health Service Corps doctors?
Well, there were these basically outside doctors brought in by the feds, paid by the feds. And that just went against the grain. It wasn't, it wasn't a normal treatment model or practice model. And some have viewed him as competition, I'm sure. And there was a younger doc that wound up being somewhat sympathetic that Bill worked on. I remember once at a meeting, I guess, up at your place. Well, yeah, you were living there, 75 or early 76. And where I finally got some things moving on that. But honestly, I was so caught up in Eastern Kentucky feuds and stuff. And there was one guy at Kentucky Miners Healthcare who got fired. Just could not. Plenty competent guy, but he just couldn't work with anybody. He fostered all kinds of stuff, including a meeting in Jenkins, Kentucky, that I attended, where there was going to be an investigation and an exposure of all the nefarious dealings of the union in doing this, putting up this program. So I go in this whole room full of folks, and I'm just saying, I'm just going to answer your questions, whatever. So we answered the questions. It's something I didn't know. Who set your salary? I don't know. Bedford Burr did, I guess. I didn't set it. And various questions like this. Learned later from a really nice guy named Julius Mullins, who was attached to, I think it's District either 17 or 21 in Pikeville, Kentucky. But there were several guys with their loaded pistols in their pockets. I mean, that's how hot it got up there. I'm glad I didn't know it beforehand. But that seemed to take some of the steam out. This fella still was causing fracture stuff by even later on in late '76. Had to go to one meeting with the feds at him. It's the same story. I mean, it's just how Trumpian outlandish claims that had no basis in fact. I mean, that's basically what they were. But there's fertile field for that, a lot of mistrust. And I don't blame people for mistrusting the UMW based on the history up through the 60s. I can't really blame them.
And how did your career with the UMW come to a close?
Well, this was a 2-year project, and knew that going in. By late '76, I pretty much determined to move back to Nashville when the program ended. Ashley Wiltshire did call about starting up an office in legal service office. He was National Legal Service at the time in Murfreesboro. I did it because there were some things I wanted to tear up. We were trying to get some additional funding, federal funding for Kentucky Miners Healthcare. Spending a lot of time to Kentucky reps at Howard Baker's office and such, working on that. And just didn't leave. I wasn't able to leave when Ashley wanted somebody, needed somebody. So that ended pretty much at the end of January 1977. I remember standing on very cold ice watching Jimmy Carter get inaugurated, but and moving back to Nashville.
John, I want to go back and pick up 3 loose ends.
Sure.
You mentioned that there had been a legal operation of sorts in Clairfield, and I wanted to ask you what your role would have been in the summer of 1974 in Clairfield, and what was going on there.
Well, the legal's office was ongoing, and this youngish lawyer from Knoxville, Greg O'Connor, was up there a day or 2 a week.
And this was sponsored by the Model Valley folks?
Yeah, to my knowledge it was. And I don't know the funding stream because I just wasn't involved in it. But Greg had taken a lot of heat from the Campbell County Bar Association. And that his practice was growing in Knoxville. He just had to pull out. There was a young lawyer named Don DeRoche who was helping staffing, but Don had not yet passed the bar. So they needed somebody to fill the gap. And I was already looking toward leaving, so I was happy to fill the gap and handle several cases for them.
This was immediately prior to you going to work with the UMW later that fall?
Yeah. Don probably had passed the bar got licensed by September '74, so he was able to, get the full wash of cases as a brand new lawyer. So, but my role pretty much ended then. I think I helped Don on a couple, but that was it.
And I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the UMW staff, in particular Mr. Ludwig, and ETRC. We heard from Neil McBride in an interview yesterday that he handled several UMW pension cases and
Mhm.
ultimately advised the UMW on how to improve the operation and fairness of their pension system.
Right.
Did you make any observations about Ludwig and
Well,
Bill McBride and ETRC?
well, I think Ludwig had a lot of male bonding with Neil. I mean, I think if he could have adopted Neil, he would. Tom was in probably his late 50s, early 60s at the time, and had been a wobbly, progressive organizer going back to the 30s. But what was going on in the ETRC really rang his bell. And Tom retired probably somewhere in '75, but he had already made the connection of Neil to the UMW people, and he was a known quantity of somebody who was sharp as a tack and could help.
And you also mentioned the connection between John Siegenthaler and Marie Cirillo of Model Valley and the Kennedys. What more can you tell us about how their personal connections later helped the political connections that they made to benefit the Model Valley and the entire area?
Well, the personal connections obviously goes back to Siegenthaler working for Bobby Kennedy in the Freedom Rider in the Justice Department and with the Freedom Riders in the early '60s. He knew Ethel Kennedy, and I'm not sure. I don't guess I ever asked exactly how that connection was made. I'm sure I knew Siegenthaler was involved, but exactly how, I don't know. That's really a better question for Marie.
Okay.
But politically, there were, and I think John alluded to it yesterday, John Williams in his interview. Jack Horn, photographer at the Tennessean, interested in strip mining. Nat Caldwell, interested in strip mining, reporter for the Tennessean. There was a huge interest, coming from the boss, Siegenthaler, the editor, in happenings and what could be done and what wasn't being done in the East Tennessee coal fields. And I attribute that to Siegenthaler.
John, you've offered a wealth of information, and I am, and the Student Health Coalition and the Archive Project is very appreciative. If you have any last reflections at a big picture level, we've been talking about a lot of the details of your work, but looking back on this part of your life, what do you find most memorable or valuable, or how do you look back on it?
Well, I mean, as with everyone personally, very rewarding. Went up there in '71 without much of a rudder and helped find it. You get involved in something that's larger than yourself. You get a picture of what can be done. And I don't doubt that's a big part now of helping send missionaries to Malawi, and working with a community development group down south of Puebla, Mexico, and here in town. I mean, through the church stuff.
And those are your
it continues in a way.
Those are your activities now in retirement.
Yeah, pretty much.
And you can draw a pretty straight line back to East Tennessee.
Particularly with the people in Mexico, yeah, they have the same community development idea. When I first heard of it, it was just, well, yeah, that's kind of the East Tennessee, East Kentucky model. Well, East Tennessee more than Kentucky, with a few less squabbling, one hopes. But community development, empowering local folks to work on prenatal care and postnatal care. Yeah, it's all, it just follows.
Thank you very much.
Sure.